All right. This is Media Sales graduate course again. This is the Sales Biography 2 presentation. This is our second sales biography of the 8-week course and our second sales presentation. I am, as always, James Hunter Bolin, or Hunter Bolin on the website. Um, Here to give y'all another video about the person I chose this time for the second time is Vincent Kennedy McMahon, or Mr. McMahon of the World Wrestling Entertainment, or WWE. If anybody knows it easier by that, is who I selected for this second sales person biography. And so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the presentation. So just a little background of who Vince McMahon is. Well, he is the founder and current chairman of the board of World Wrestling Entertainment, so WWE or Pro Wrestling, or if it's easier for you to understand via maybe the thing Stone Cold Steve Austin or John Cena or Hulk Hogan does. If you don't watch wrestling like a lot of people do, like I do, and he is really truly a pioneer in the world of professional wrestling, because as we go through this presentation, you'll see that professional wrestling as it is today definitely was not how it was back when he started in the 1960s and transitioned into the 70s, and as big as it is to now. And he is the part. He's the reason for that. Even non-wrestling fans and non-wrestling people understand what WrestleMania is, and he's a big part of that. And I'll touch on that in the presentation. And hopefully y'all really enjoy his story, because I know I've seen it a lot of times in documentaries, and I really had the pleasure to type it out in my own words in the sales biography presentation here in this project for this media sales class. So let's jump right into it. Vincent Kennedy McMahon, he was born on August 24th, 1945 in Pinehurst, North Carolina. As an infant, his parents divorced. He was born into a family, though, of wrestling and boxing promoters. His grandfather, Jess McMahon, and his dad, Vince McMahon Sr., were big promoters in the Northeast Territory of the United States. They were really synonymous with Madison Square Garden, and from a young age, that's what Vince wanted to do, as most men want to do, or young boys want to do when they are growing up. They want to be what their father was. And Vince wanted to be a wrestling promoter like his grandfather and his father before him. But it was a really interesting and hard childhood for Vince, as because he didn't even see his father, Vince Sr., until he was 12 years old, because his parents divorced, like I mentioned. It was a rough upbringing for Vince. He had a learning disability of dyslexia, and he really struggled as a youth. He was a troublemaker, and growing up in a broken home is difficult for people. And he really took that out on, being a person that was always in trouble, and didn't help with his learning disability. And so he thought, and his mother thought, it would be best for him to enroll in a military institution to finish his high school career. So that's what he did. He enrolled in the Fishbourne, Military Academy, and finally it straightened him out, and he learned to work hard and to make up for his disability, and graduated and straightened himself out in 1964 is when he graduated high school. Sorry about that. And for right out of high school, he wanted to go and work with his dad. He had, as the older he got, the better relationship he grew with his father, and he was able to communicate with him. And so he wanted to work for his dad straight out of high school, but his dad, told him against it. He wanted him to go to college to get a degree, to maybe find a field that is more consistent work than being a boxing or a wrestling promoter at the time. So Vince listened to his father, and he enrolled at East Carolina University and got a business degree in 4 years. So in 1968, after graduating from there, instead of working for his father, Vince, decided to, heed his advice and tried his hand at being a traveling salesman. And that was a failure for Vince. It really struggled selling random items, even at one point selling paper cups as a traveling salesman, which was really funny to me when I was looking it up in the research, that I didn't know traveling salesmen sold something as simple as paper cups. But it was a different time back in 1969. So with the failure of that, he went to his father and one last ditch effort to let him work in the wrestling business. And he begged his father and begged his father, and his father, Vince Sr., finally decided to let Vince work in his company at the time, which was Capital Wrestling Corporation, which would later become known as the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, so the WWF, in 1969 or in late 1969, and Vince became a outside ring announcer or an interviewer. So like when the wrestlers would win the match or before they would go into the match, Vince would stop them and ask them questions like, what are you going to do in this match, or something like that, to try to get the wrestler's personality to show. And that is how Vince broke into the business under his father's company. So like I said, his father was the big time promoter in the Northwest Territory, and wrestling at the time is not what it is today. As it is today, you have the WWE, which is kind of like the NFL of professional wrestling, and then underneath it, you have what is called NXT, which is a developmental brand for young wrestlers that are contracted by the WWE. That once they graduate from NXT, they will go up to the WWE, where you see them on like Monday Night Raw or Friday Night SmackDown. And if you're not on NXT or WWE, you're in what is called the independent circuit. So you're just in these wrestling promotions that go to small towns, and you're trying to get film to people in the WWE to give you a tryout and try to make it onto the NXT roster. And then you could also go across seas to Japan, where wrestling is big over there, and Mexico as well with the Lucha Libre style, if anyone is familiar with that. So there are a lot of different ways to get to the WWE, but most of the time it's the WWE. That's it. It's the pinnacle. And back in the late '60s, early '70s, wrestling was not like that. It was a lot smaller. It was a more local type of deal, and how it was operated was under something called the National Wrestling Alliance, or the NWA. At the time, is that the United States was broken up into territories, and each territory had its own wrestling promotion, and that own wrestling promotion had their own promoter. And so at the time, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation was under the NWA, and Vince Sr. was the head promoter of the Northeast Territory, and their main spot was Madison Square Garden in New York City. Working under his father, Vince had big plans for the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, but he just kept them to himself because he had finally gotten his father's blessing to work for him. He didn't really want to ruin it just yet. So working as a ringside announcer for 2 years, from 69 to 71, Vince finally got his shot to actually promote his first wrestling card. So within the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, Vince was given control of a smaller show within that federation in the Maine area. And in Maine is where he first promoted his very first wrestling card and wrestling show in 1971. And it was a big success. Vince really took to the promoting life well. He did a really good job of studying what his father did and coming up with ideas of his own, and was always a smash hit in Maine, and kept working up from there to gradually get to where he became one of the bigger promoters in his dad's federation, which was a really huge step for Vince in his young career. And as we continued going later into the 70s, Vince's really idea for what would become the WWE really started to take place. So when Vince broke into the business of wrestling, he had the idea of taking his father's corporation global. He didn't want to just stay in the Northeast Territory. He wanted to go global. And at the time with the NWA and all these different territories, the way it worked is that if somebody was popular in Oregon, in that territory, and let's say the McMahons wanted to use them in New York, then the New York Federation would pay the Oregon Federation to fly their star over to New York so the New York crowd could see him. And that's how it worked. You didn't take your talent over to Oregon. You borrowed their talent for like one show only in New York, and then vice versa. So it was kind of a unwritten rule to not go into another person's territory. And Vince McMahon did not like that unwritten rule. He wanted to take the WWF global. And so he really did that kind of behind his dad's back. And he did that by taking advantage of the newest technology that was, always changing and always getting better at the time, which was television. And at the time, with these local territories, wrestling was always on Saturday mornings, and it would be a local deal. So, like if you were in New York, you saw the WWF, but if you were in Georgia, you probably saw something called Jim Crockett Promotions, which would later become WCW. So, if you were in Georgia, that's all you saw for wrestling, and you never saw a WWF guy unless the Georgia territory borrowed from the New York territory. And so Vince thought it would be a good idea to kind of start go into these other territories and not borrowing talent, but just taking the WWF's talent into their territories. And he used that with television. So what he did was he started taping shows and taping them in really good quality for the time of the WWF, and he would send those tapes to TV markets in other territories. And then he would start taking talent to other territories where he had sent the tapes. And he would kind of use the simple philosophy of, come see us on TV. Like, you've just seen these WWF stars on TV all the way from New York. Now come see them in person, live in North Carolina, or something like that. And so he really slowly started to go to the territories with less money and start slowly taking over the wrestling business. And it was revolutionary at the time, and a lot of people really were kind of up in arms with Vince Sr. because his son is coming in here and ruining what they had established in the NWA. But no one really could stop them. They were doing too well, and it was really entertaining, and it was fun for fans of wrestling to see, this amazing traveling circus. Really is what it was. Never before had somebody from New York traveled all the way to Florida or Texas and done a wrestling show like that. It was interesting, and it was eye opening to like a local person, because wow, this person's like famous. You got that kind of feel of being famous, that like I said, that as seen on TV effect. Like, wow, I saw them in New York, in Madison Square Garden, and now they're in this local place in Texas. That's pretty cool. So I'm gonna have to go check that out. And that's what really Vince was doing, and he was picking on the smaller territories at the time. And once they started taking over those smaller territories, he would go after the bigger territories and the bigger territories. And eventually, by 1982, not only was he the head of his father's company now, he had basically just taken out all of the smaller territories in the NWA, and it was basically deceased at the time in 1982, and there was really only 2 wrestling promotions that were still alive and kicking, and Vince was one of them. And that was because he had the idea to be the person, be the big fish to eat all the other little fish. He didn't want to be the one that got eaten up. He wanted to be the one doing, the eating. He wanted to be the predator. And it was a really, really revolutionary idea and a really unique concept at the time to take wrestling global from something that was, in your local high school gym to, worldwide, and to do all this and really capitalize on the popularity of wrestling. And by 1982, the WWF, which is what he changed the name to, is the World Wrestling Federation, took out one W to make it easier on everybody. He really started changing the game, and he was a game changer in that sense. And so now in 1982, Vince was rolling. He had a lot of talent at the time, and his shows were being broadcast in all different types of markets, and he was really doing a fine job at keeping his promotion afloat and successful. And his biggest competition at the time, like I said, was Jim Crockett Promotions and WCW. And so he always had to stay on ball with them and what they were doing. And he had a really bright idea, an idea that would go down in history as revolutionary again. And so at the time, MTV had just started making headway. And wrestling at the time was viewed as real. A lot of people didn't see it for what it was, which was just a glorified soap opera with body slams that were choreographed. People believed that wrestling was real back in 1982, and they believed it. And Vince had the idea to kind of make it more entertainment based, still trying to get that realistic feel of being in a fight, but add more pop culture to it. And so his idea was to partner with MTV and allow wrestlers to be in music videos, and then vice versa, when they had wrestling tapings to go on TV, he would get rock stars and pop stars to either sit at ringside or accompany wrestlers to the ring and try to get a crossover appeal, to try to get fans of MTV and the music industry to start liking wrestling, and then in turn get wrestling fans to start liking music and different types of that, and seeing more music videos. And I think that's really in the 80s when you started to see what the WWE is now today. You know, high production value, rock and roll music to bring wrestlers down to the ring. You know, celebrities always being in the front row, always trying to get any kind of exposure, any kind of crossover effect. That's what the WWE had turned into. And so in 1982, he struck a deal with MTV. They called it the Rock and Wrestling Connection. And it was really prominent with one person in particular, and that was Cyndi Lauper, who at the time was, you know, just one of the biggest pop stars in America. And a really famous video, if you ever get a chance to check it out, you should check it out. It's Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper, was one of her bigger videos. And in that video, her father in the video is actually a wrestler by the name of Captain Lou Albano, and really used her and her crossover appeal to get more people to tune in to wrestling. And then also with the Rock and Wrestling Connection, Vince had two major shows promoted on MTV, that ran on MTV and were huge success and huge ratings juggernauts. And Cyndi Lauper was involved in both of those shows, being a manager for Wendy Richter in the women's championship matches on those shows. And so you have all these people watching these music videos on MTV with, you know, a wrestler in the video, and then, you know, maybe the next program after that is a wrestling show with Cyndi Lauper. Boom, right there. So already you have a crossover appeal, and it was just game changing at the time to take wrestling from what it is and try to focus it as more of a sport to turn it into an entertainment for the whole entire family to enjoy. It's not just going to be a sport where the guys just go and watch guys beat up on each other for fun. It's not boxing. It's pro wrestling. It's something different. It's something that you and your mom and your dad and your sister can all go to, and there's something for everybody. You know, there's the women's wrestling with Cyndi Lauper and you know, the music performances and stuff like that. Then you got the men with the Hulk Hogans and the Rowdy Pipers and, you know, the big muscle guys for the guys. It was a family ordeal, and it was a family event. And he really took advantage of the popularity of MTV and pop culture to really make an event that was just must-see television at the time in 1984. And then Vince took it a step further. In 1985, he had his biggest idea to date. He was going to make a wrestling super show, like a show to end all shows in the world of wrestling. And he came up with this idea on vacation, and a lot of names were bounced around, but then they finally settled on WrestleMania, the showcase of the Immortals, the biggest show to end all shows. And Vince knew that this couldn't be a show that you could just put on local television. This had to be a show, that was, you know, that people had to pay to see, even if you weren't there in person. So he decided to run this show on closed circuit television at over 200 venues in the world. And at the time, it was the biggest gamble of Vince's life, because he put all his money into promoting and all his money into advertising and getting the word out there that WrestleMania was happening. And so after, you know, all of this promoting and stuff, if WrestleMania wasn't going to be a success, Vince and his company were probably going to fold, because all their money and all their last dimes were pushed into WrestleMania. And really, it had to be a success. It was either win or go home for WrestleMania. And Vince McMahon did everything possible to make sure that people knew that this was an event for everybody, not just an event of pro wrestling. It was a sports entertainment spectacular event. And so he had Mr. T in the main event, which is huge. And Mr. T is not a wrestler. Mr. T is a crossover star. And that's another thing that he did. You know, I mean, that's just unbelievable to this day how he was able to get that crossover appeal back in 1985. At this point is when WrestleMania happened. Because the main event, if anyone doesn't know, it was Hulk Hogan and Mr. T versus Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. and having Mr. T wrestle a match is crazy. And you had all these super, just mega stars at the event. Muhammad Ali was a guest referee. Liberace was there to sing and perform. Cyndi Lauper was there again at the first WrestleMania. You had all these just famous people at this one event, and it was unbelievable. And even the night before WrestleMania, Hulk Hogan and Mr. T hosted Saturday Night Live on NBC. It was just crazy how far and how much money they put into promoting this, and it just had to be a success. And the closed circuit television was a risk, but it paid off because over 1 million people came out to closed circuit locations across the world to watch WrestleMania, and wrestling really hit its first boom in the 1980s, and it became the golden age of wrestling. And it was all because of Vince McMahon's idea to use that crossover appeal to get stars from the world of pop culture into wrestling and make wrestling more than just wrestling, make it sports entertainment. And using the piggybacking of WrestleMania 1, they continued the success to WrestleMania 2, and then to WrestleMania 3, they really hit it big. Going into WrestleMania 3, Vince struck up a deal with a friend at NBC named Dick Ebersol to start running a wrestling show on NBC every other Saturday night, Saturday night's main event. And it was a revolutionary show, and it got his program worldwide on NBC to every household in the country every Saturday night. And that's something that is unbelievable. Right before Saturday Night Live, which was really popular at the time, had everyone in the country watching this. And his next goal at WrestleMania 3 was to break the all-time attendance record. And he did that using his megastar Hulk Hogan and his opponent, the perfect villain at the time, Andre the Giant. And those are two names that are still recognizable today, even to non-wrestling fans, because that's how much of a moment Vince McMahon sold to the fans, that it was the irresistible force meeting the immovable object. It was something that was must-see to everyone in the world. So they went to the Pontiac Silverdome in 1987, and they broke the indoor attendance record. As it was reported, 93,173 people were in attendance at WrestleMania 3 to watch Hulk Hogan body slam the Giant, to slay the Giant, and defend his WWE Championship at an event that was also star-studded. Bob Uecker was there, the famous baseball announcer. Aretha Franklin sang America the Beautiful before the event. Alice Cooper was in the event. I mean, all these crossover stars, all these famous people, this pop culture phenomenon event happened. And it was all under the mind of Vince McMahon, and wrestling was at its peak in 1987 with WrestleMania 3. But as we go into the early 90s, wrestling took a huge decline. There was a huge trial. Since wrestling was still kind of viewed as a legitimate sport, they were brought under fire in 1994, actually, for a steroid trial. And Vince McMahon had to go in front of a court and say that that what we do is fake, and that these guys aren't true athletes, and they had to come up with a steroid policy. And it really exposed pro wrestling for what it actually was to the minds of the viewers at the time, who thought Hulk Hogan was this guy that was just a hard worker and stuff, but he was on steroids. And so was other stars like the Ultimate Warrior and the Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal, and all these wrestling stars. They were kind of caught out as frauds. And the early 90s were dark days for the WWF. Really low viewership, lowest pay-per-view buy rates, and all sorts of things that when pay-per-view got in the swing, buy rates for the WWF were way low compared to where they were in 1987 with WrestleMania 3, where in WrestleMania 3 they did 10 million pay-per-view buys for that show, where in 1995 you could barely get, they were barely cracking 1 million to 2 million people pay-per-view buys. At the time, sometimes they didn't even break 1 million, and that's really terrible for a wrestling show to do. The product was down, and his competitor throughout this time, WCW, really started picking things up after the steroid trial, because what they did was they took the family-friendly approach of pro wrestling in the 80s, and they changed it up to fit the demographic of the late 90s, kind of an edgier, anti-establishment, grunge rock kind of, just out there kind of feel of the late 90s. It was a different time than the late 80s. And so WCW struck gold with something called the New World Order, or the NWO. And they portrayed kind of a realistic feel to pro wrestling. It kind of felt like it wasn't, a sport, but it was more of like street brawls, and it was edgy, and it was kind of a sex sales kind of type of atmosphere with, women, flaunting their assets to the screen, and these guys using the real names. There wasn't, fake names like like Andre the Giant or Diesel or Razor Ramon. It was, they were using their real name, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, and they were really doing things that you'd never seen on wrestling programs, like spray painting people's bodies and hitting people with lead pipes in the head and hitting people with chairs in the head and doing brutal things, and really got wrestling in the mainstream, and they were popular. They were the cool thing. They were the hip new thing in town, was the NWO. And people responded to that, and people definitely stopped watching the WWF at the time that was still going for that cartoony family feel, to go to this NWO, this WCW product that was revolutionary at the time. And so Vince was back up against the wall again and really didn't know where to go from here, but he listened to his audience. He saw that people were tuning out of the WWF because it was that kid-friendly approach, and tuning into WCW because it was edgier, it was cool. So that's what he did. In late 1997, he started a movement, and they called it the Attitude Era. They started to bring in different types of wrestlers and different types of storylines in wrestling to make it more realistic and to make it more, edgy, cool. They brought in more women that were, giving that sex sales appeal. Instead of catering to the children, they were catering to that demographic of like that 18 to 30-year-old male, and really became a huge success. And a lot of that was due to stars like Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock, who is actually the highest paid movie star in the world right now. Mankind or Mick Foley, The Undertaker, Triple H, Shawn Michaels, names that, a lot of people know. Even if you don't watch wrestling, people know who Stone Cold Steve Austin is, and people know who The Rock is. And it was that edginess and the writing and the way they just changed things on a dime, just to go from a cartoony approach to that change of attitude and, kind of that sex sales, edgier, cool look and that cool vibe, really saved Vince's company. And they were better at doing that edginess than than WCW was, and it showed, as because from 1997 on, WWE slowly started to take control, and in late 1998 they finally took control again of the wrestling world, and they were the most popular show on television, regardless if it was wrestling or just any show at all. They were the it thing. They were unbelievable at the time, and the wrestling popularity in the 90s I don't think will ever be reached again. The late 90s were, the 80s were definitely the golden age of pro wrestling, but the late 90s was that resurgence into pop culture, and it was cool to be a wrestling fan back in the 90s. And now it's, it's not as big, but people still watch wrestling today, but no one will ever reach the popularity of Stone Cold Steve Austin and the popularity of the WWF in the late 90s. And Vince McMahon was always doing a really good job of listening to his audience, catering to them, trying to figure out what they wanted to see every week on Monday Night Raw, and making sure that his company stayed afloat and that he would not lose, because he couldn't take failure. He wasn't a guy that was a one to fail. He always loved competition, and he wanted to crush the competition at WCW because they were kicking their butts for a few years, WCW was, but Vince responded well to that, really doing a good job catering to his audience, marketing the crap out of their new megastars of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock, and really took the wrestling world again by storm, and just the world by storm in general, with their pop culture appeal. And it paid off for them, because in 2001 WCW would eventually fold, and Vince McMahon would buy WCW, and now you have wrestling in the landscape that it is to this day, where the WWE is like the NFL of pro wrestling, and it's been that way since 2002. And the WWE is always staying with the times. As times got less edgier and kind of that fade of the late 90s wore off, the WWE kind of transitioned back into kind of a PG era, is what they called it, a more kid-friendly approach. to make sure that their company would stay afloat and in the good, positive eyes of the world for longevity. It continues to this day, and they are always at the forefront of the changing technologies and the stuff in the world. They have their own streaming service now. They don't do pay-per-views anymore. They have a Netflix-like streaming service called the WWE Network. It's $10.99 a month, and on that you get all original programming, all old programming from the past. So, like if you're a fan of Hulk Hogan, you can watch all of his matches on there. If you're a fan of Stone Cold Steve Austin from the 90s, you can watch that on there. They do all of their pay-per-view events. They do WrestleMania through the WWE Network, and they are strictly a subscriber-based, company now with their shows. They still have Monday Night Raw on the USA Network, which is the longest-running weekly episodic television show in history. They still have Friday Night SmackDown, which is just behind The Simpsons, I believe, is the second longest running show in history. I think it's The Simpsons or something else. I can't remember. But SmackDown is actually about to have its, I think it's 20th or 25th anniversary coming up soon. So, I mean, they're still on, they're still on television shows that can be reached worldwide. And then they have their own streaming service, just like Netflix, that reaches worldwide for an affordable price for any family. That you can watch all of these great events and all these, monumental new moments, if you will, for the World Wrestling Entertainment or the WWE. Excuse me. And so it's really unbelievable how his company is always willing to change and willing to get with the times. And that's just another notch in his belt of being a great salesman. He was always brash. He was always bold. Wanting to do things like take his, father's wrestling promotion global when it was frowned upon, never accepting failure, willing to risk it all, and be somebody that was revolutionary, and always be somebody that was looked upon as a guy that was going to do whatever it took to succeed. Never really wanting to backstab anybody or anything like that, but just always looking at what the competitor was doing and either doing something different that was better or doing what they were doing but better. That's like because WCW beat him to the punch as far as being edgy and cool, but Vince won out with doing it better. They do a great job of listening to their audience and really trying to do what is best for business for them and keep with the times and, cater to their fans and always make sure that the WWE is growing and growing and growing. I mean, WrestleMania is always a talked about event, always in April or April or late March every single year, that even fans who aren't wrestling fans, they know what WrestleMania is and they know what the WWE is around that time. And it's unbelievable that they have had this longevity, and it's all because of Vince McMahon. Somebody with a learning disability that always fought hard, that always studied and did everything, to the best of his abilities, and always was on top of, revolutionary ideas, using like simple tactics like I've seen you on TV effect, and being somebody that was willing to push the envelope when no one else was. That's what Vince McMahon was, being that unique salesman, is the fact that he never sold clothes, he never sold shoes and stuff like that. Like Phil Knight in my last bio. He was selling a soap opera for men and a soap opera for families, just with body slams is the best way I can describe the WWE. And he did a really good job of it. And they also capitalized on popularity with merchandise sales. And, because, there's WWE t-shirts everywhere. There's WWE action figures. There's WWE video games. There's WWE bed sheets, towels, soap. There, you name it, they got it. And, it's all on the mind of Vince McMahon to get him to that point, and he's still the chairman of the board today. He's been in charge since 1982, and he hasn't looked back since. And he's, always will forever be looked at as a controversial but, bold figure that, you can't deny his success, and you can't deny his willingness to try new ventures and always, willing to bounce back and come back after failures. Just when it seems like WWE is about to fade into existence again, they jump right back in the forefront with something else new, something else, amazing and brash. And they've had crossover stars that always get their product still back out there. I mean, you got The Rock, who was a wrestler, who's like I mentioned, the highest paid actor in the world. John Cena is now a well-known actor who was also a wrestler before him, and Vince was the first to use that crossover appeal, and they still use it to this day. And it's really just a testament to his salesmanship and his mind for an industry that was ahead of his time, and he truly was a pioneer and somebody that I really enjoyed. I have a documentary made on him that I based a lot of this presentation off of. It's called McMahon. It was made back in 2006. If you ever get a chance to check that out, definitely do so. If you like my presentation, because you'll love the documentary. It was really good, and it really delves even deeper into how good of a salesman and how good of a mind this guy has for the world of television and the industry of pro wrestling, and really shows all of his skills. So that'll wrap it up for this second sales presentation. My name is James Hunter Bowling again. I hope y'all enjoyed it. This is for my media sales graduate class, and this will be posted on my YouTube channel. So if you like the video, give me a like, and then also if you appreciate it if you can give me a subscribe to my channel as well. Yeah, but I hope everybody enjoyed it, and I hope all the responses are good in the comment section below. So thanks again, and I'll see y'all next time.